no matter where we were doing the show today, now we're doing it, I'm in Birmingham, Alabama, you're in the Carolinas. But no matter where we were doing the show from today, you start today off with a seismic upset of number one Alabama going down. If we were doing Monday Morning Live today from Denver, Colorado, we'd probably start off talking about the Broncos uniforms like we did, and then we'd go quickly to Vanderbilt beating Alabama. I'd love to sit here and say, man, you know, the double reverse pass caught Alabama sleeping. There were balls bouncing off the helmets into the receiver's hands like they were when Hugh Freeze beat Alabama. There was a kick six like an Auburn win over Alabama. But there was nothing unique about what Vandy did to Alabama except they kicked a little butt for 60 minutes.
Yeah, this wasn't one of those fluke scenarios. And I think it's really important. We can talk all day long about Alabama or deficiencies or what went wrong or what they didn't do well. But that would diminish the fact that Vanderbilt outcoached, outclassed, out-executed Alabama for 4 quarters in that game. And on that day, Vanderbilt was the better football team. That doesn't mean they had better athletes. It doesn't mean they have better players across the board. It doesn't mean they have more depth. On that day, they played better team football than Alabama did. And they deserve a ton of credit for their approach and their execution and their effort. All of those things were superior to Alabama on Saturday. And that's a fact. You know, you've heard me say this on your show, I don't know how many years going back. Generally, when you are outmatched or you're outclassed athletically, you have to play your absolute best ball game, and the other team has to do something to help you. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case on Saturday. I didn't think that Alabama overly gave the football game to Vanderbilt. I just think Vanderbilt was better.
I want to ask you some very simple questions, but to continue on just the monumental upset that this was, David Hale, your colleague at ESPN.com, writes, "This is the Washington Generals beating the Globetrotters, Charlie Brown kicking the ball, and Dabo Swinney taking a transfer all rolled into one." Your thoughts on that comment?
Well, David is quite creative on social media. I'll give him that. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, when you consider the emotion coming off of the Georgia game and the week leading up, and nobody's talking about Vanderbilt, for all intents and purposes, if you would have looked at the week leading up to this game, you would have just considered Alabama had a bye week. I mean, that's the attention that was placed upon this weekend. Nobody talked about Alabama, the game against Vanderbilt. All of the talk the entire week leading up to the game was about Alabama's performance versus Georgia and the Georgia game and how it played out. And it almost created, well, it did create the perfect recipe for disaster on Saturday afternoon.
This is Monday Morning Live. We're going to talk a lot about Alabama and Vandy here to start with. Then we'll get into some other college football games. Then we'll circle back to Alabama and Vandy. And then we will go to some of the biggest games in the country. Middle 8 comes up at 8 Central Time, right when we're done. And then the next round is with you at 9. Don't forget all your social media platforms at Next Round Live. Like and subscribe everywhere. Give us a thumbs up if you're watching us on YouTube this morning, as many of you are. We'll get to some of your comments first, but can I just throw out the sheer bulliness of Vandy over Alabama here? I mean, these are numbers of when Alabama, in their heyday of Nick Saban, back in the early days when they were building it, these are the type of numbers that Alabama had against major opponents to win games. They had 9 more first downs, Vandy did, than Alabama. They had more rushing yards, Vandy did, than Alabama. Most of those coming up the gut between the tackles in that game. They were 12 of 18 on third downs. They were 1 of 1 on fourth downs, and they held the ball 42 minutes. 42 minutes, leaving Alabama just 17 minutes and change. How many times in early Saban days did you see Alabama do that anaconda just stretching around somebody's torso and strangling them to death, not allowing them to breathe with that 9, 10, 11-minute drive to start the second half that just finished everybody off? Vandy did that time and time again on Saturday.
Yeah, they did. And several years back where I introduced you guys to the four stats that matter.
Yes.
You remember that, Jim? Okay, so they are third down conversion rate, turnover margin, rush attempts, and average yards per pass attempt.
Yeah.
And I told you guys if you win three of those four or four of those four, you are going to win the football game. Vandy won three of the four.
Yeah. Which one did they not win? Because it felt like they won them all.
Yeah, it did feel like they won them all. I want to say, average yards per pass attempt. Well, they did win that one.
I know they had 6 receivers who averaged receiving yards were double digits. They only had one guy, and that was the guy who caught the game winner. One reception, 6 yards. Everybody else had double-digit receptions. It's an amazing stat, but there's nothing statistical in here that says it was a fluke. They beat them every day and twice on Sunday.
They did. And the third down one, to me, is the most alarming one because – essentially, a couple of things are reflective of that. Number one, you don't have that rate on third down if you are 3rd and 7+. So essentially, the success on first and second down gets you into 3rd and manageable, 3rd and short, and your probability for converting that goes way up. And so Alabama's inability to get off the field on third down then leads directly to that 42-minute time of possession that Vanderbilt maintained throughout the course of the game. So, we can talk, statistics and all of those sorts of things. I thought there were 2 defining things in the game for me. Vanderbilt's creativity on offense and utilization of triple option principles, and Alabama's inability to tackle.
Yes.
Alabama had 17 plays in that game where they allowed 4 yards or more after contact. That is a staggering number and to put it in your words, from an Alabama defense that's become so accustomed to just suffocating people. And by the way, Alabama going into that game was fantastic on third down on defense.
I would say that a lot of the yards after contact, missed tackle situations were those third down passes out in front of the sticks that the DB would miss a tackle on, and they would fight forward for 2 or 3 yards. Technically, I don't know if they always missed the tackle. They would just lock up and get drugged for 2 yards past the sticks sometimes. I'll go back and watch it for a third time, but I think a lot of those came right then.
Yeah, and I think that was the thing that probably was most glaring to me was I don't want to say that there was a lack of effort. I'm not convinced of that. But I did think there was a lack of passion and a lack of physicality from what we've become accustomed to seeing from Alabama that generally would erase getting dragged for an extra 3 or 4 yards or breaking a tackle and gaining another 7 yards. That's what I thought was missing on defense.
Again, we'll get back to this game later on. There's so much to talk about, but I wanted to make sure I gave Vandy their claps and their flowers and their kudos here to start with for winning the game before we talk about everything Alabama did wrong. So I feel like we've done that now for 11 minutes of talking about what Vandy did right, and it was everything to beat Alabama. I want to get some comments first. I did with Chris Marler last night, Dunaway After Dark. Marler says that Bama is a lock in the playoffs if they go 10-2. Blake says it's laughable for him to say that this morning in the chat room. But don't you believe the Georgia win, the Wisconsin win, and any of these other wins that get you to 10-2? Alabama is a lock in the playoffs at 10-2. You agree?
Absolutely, they are. And on top of it, they have branding. And if you sat there and said, "Okay, we're gonna put Alabama at 13," somebody show me 12 teams that are better than them.
That's right.
Come on. Give me a break. Listen, they screwed up. They got their asses beat. I mean, that's the bottom line. But if they're going to go 10-2, they're absolutely getting in the playoff.
I've discussed it with Roman Harper on our show back in the summer, and maybe even talked to you a couple of times about it in my lifetime as well. The defensive scheme that Kane Womack is running at Alabama, the 3-3-5, how is it different from Nick Saban's defense? And is it a defensive scheme that struggles against power running attacks or option attacks like we saw on Saturday? Does Alabama have a schematic problem on the defensive side of the football, in your opinion?
No, I think it's too early and it's premature to say that. I think it's very easy to go down that path after having 17 years of the exact same scheme and approach on defense. It is tailored a bit more towards having to deal with spread principles and playing in space and being able to create some confusion and negative plays by how you align on defense. It's not as standard as just seeing your 4-down fronts. That's the myth about Alabama previously. Everybody said, well, Alabama's, in 3-down defense. They're really not. That was only about 25 to 28% of the time. The rest of the time they're in a 4-down front. But the 4-2-5 or 3-3-5 stack, however you want to look at it, is far more tailored to space. Does that mean that they weren't prepared to be able to handle what Vanderbilt did? I don't think so. I don't think that's fair to say that just yet. I mean, if we continue to see multiple occasions of a defense go out and not be able to handle what's being thrown at them, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think this was far more about just getting physically beat by a team, more so than it was whether or not you're in the right scheme. We're not having this conversation right now if Alabama tackles better. If you watch the very first touchdown run from Vanderbilt on the goal line, that defined the entire game for Alabama on defense. You watch how that play unfolded with the lead block, with the inability to make the tackle, and then getting pushed into the end zone. That literally was reflective of the entire day. That has nothing to do with scheme. That's just getting beat.
Tony wants to know in the chat room presented by our friends at mybookie.ag, that chat room over there, promo code next round. Tony wants to know, is this basically like the blank through the 10 horn game Saban talked about with Georgia Southern, or playing a service academy that it will not rear its ugly head the rest of the year with this defense? Is there a problem you think that other teams can expose, or is this just styles make fights, and Vandy had the right style to take it to Bama?
I would say it's the latter, and it was a fantastic schematic effort and approach by Vanderbilt. I mean, they did a couple of things offensively that I had to go back and say, wait, what just happened in the backfield right there? And you could tell Alabama's heads were spinning on defense. So they had some wrinkles. They had some good stuff. Again, staying on the field in 3rd down. But I thought about that quote from Alabama and Nick Saban that whole entire game when it was brought up with his rendering, I guess you could say, of what took place that day against Georgia Southern. And yeah, I think this does happen to people playing service academies. I remember several years back, Army went to play Oklahoma and almost beat Oklahoma. It was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, right before the pandemic. And Oklahoma had no answers. I mean, absolutely none. And there is nobody on that Army team that would have started a football game for Oklahoma. So I think before we jump into mass conclusions here about, what this could project going forward, I do think that this was one of those deals where you weren't as prepared as the other team, and you weren't as physical as the other team, and you just flat out got beat.
Cheese is asking about it. Charlie is commenting on it. Several other folks down through the chat room, Default Name is talking about it. There are a lot of people talking about players' attitude, smack talking, specifically on defense. Cheese writes, very disappointed in Malachi Moore. Not a very good look. Talk to me about playing with intensity and letting your actions do the talking as opposed to actually talking, and then late in that game, a penalty, and then he refuses to come off the field when the coaches are trying to substitute for him. Alabama, I mean, I'm old, so I'm going to say, I said this last night on Dunaway After Dark, I'll say it now. I am old. but I am all for celebrating touchdowns. I don't mind the dancing. I don't mind after the first down catch and when you do this right here. But here's the video from the stands of Malachi Moore refusing to come off the field. Kane Womack had sent in a player. Malachi sent the player back off, and Womack's out on the 40 and was literally trying to get him off the field. Even Kalen DeBoer stepped out for a second trying to get him off, and Malachi refused to come off in the final seconds. Something we'll hear from Coach later on today maybe about Malachi Moore or anything. He talked about it briefly afterwards. You played the game, Lukes. I did not play the game at that level. You played the game. Talk to me about the smack talking. And again, I'm all for the casual smack talking in between, especially receivers and DBs. But it seemed to be a running problem for Alabama this whole game that they wouldn't shut up and play.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's got to be addressed, and it's got to be nipped in the bud immediately. And trash talking is one thing, and backing it up is something that's got to follow it if you're going to take that path. But the other actions of Malachi Moore, the not coming off the field, the throwing his mouthpiece, the kicking of the ball once it was laid down at the end, absolutely inexcusable, and he needs to be sat down. And he needs to be sat down, and it's an opportunity for Kalen DeBoer from a leadership perspective, from a discipline perspective, to take the opportunity to send a message to the rest of his team what's going to be tolerated, what's not going to be tolerated, and what the standard and expectation level is at Alabama. I don't care if it's Nick Saban or anybody else, that if you conduct yourself in that manner, you're going to be standing on the sideline next to me. And I'm with you, man. I'm not a get off my lawn guy with a lot of this stuff, but personal conduct and managing your emotions and being able to back up your talk is paramount to disciplined, good football teams that don't beat themselves. And I think it was so glaring because we hadn't seen that before, right? And so it's going to be easy to place blame on, oh, well, it's the leadership, or, oh, it's the new approach, and this would have never happened under Nick Saban. Okay, well, maybe all of that's true. I don't know. I think it's a bit premature to say that. But it's the conduct and the inability to manage your emotions that I have the biggest problem with.
The real Mr. Tibbs, he was misguided, but in Moore's defense, he was the only guy on defense showing an ounce of emotion. Again, in my opinion, your emotion is shown in how you're playing physically, right? It's how you're not getting pushed around. It's how you're making the tackle, not missing the tackles. But some people have to crank their engines, and maybe he was trying to crank the engines of someone else, but at the end it was over with. Pritch Law, the defense was on skates all day. One handoff up the middle. Lawson was sprinting parallel to the line of scrimmage, looking toward the sideline. Running back went right by him. Just one of those kind of days there. You play South Carolina this week. Does South Carolina do anything? Do they have the potential to do anything they can take from Vandy to stress that Bama defense again?
Well, they've got an athletic quarterback. I think that's the one thing you've got to be concerned about first and foremost, because the quarterback can be a problem. I don't know if you copy or carry over game plans from one opponent to the next. And, this team did that, so we're going to do the exact same thing. I don't believe it works that way. Will there be some wrinkles or some things that they saw on tape that they think they could take advantage of? Absolutely. I probably wouldn't want to be South Carolina this week. I mean, that's probably not the result you wanted to see when now Alabama has an opportunity to respond and to react. And I think that's more, to me, the important part of this whole equation. And that is not who you're playing, how you are playing, because there is plenty on that tape for them to be concerned about that takes precedent over what South Carolina is going to be doing. They've got a lot on Alabama's got a lot on their plate this week. And so I think it's going to be about them. It's going to be about response. It's going to be about discipline. It's going to be about physicality. All of the things that seemed to be lacking last week are what's going to be paramount to being addressed this week.